Hello, this presentation will revolve around factors affecting the prospects of democracy in Nigeria. For my research, I used the Afrobarometer dataset for Nigeria, in which there were 2,220 cases. I will be using correlation, multiple regression, and dummy variables to show my results. Nigeria is the most populous country in Africa, containing over 120 million people. It is Africa's second largest economy and boasts an immense amount of natural resources. Although Nigeria has been largely recognized as democratic, it retains features that compromise this status. While this is apparent, the country is considered a model for African growth and democracy. I want to explore Nigeria's prospects in retaining this image, and pose a question of what this can potentially entail for other democracies, both African and non-African. For my dependent variable, I coded two questions into an index. The first question asked respondents to indicate how much of a democracy they think Nigeria is today, with options ranging from not a democracy to a full democracy. The second question asked respondents how satisfied they were with how democracy works in Nigeria. Both questions together yielded an alpha of 0.6638, which means that they were appropriate to form an index together. The mean and mode, according to the frequencies of MyIndex, showed that most people have a low to medium prospect of democracy in Nigeria. Research. Susan Rice's Prospects of Democracy describes Nigerian attitudes towards democracy as informed by an autocratic and corrupt past. She argues that dialogue between government and civil society is a critical precursor to democratization and open and fair elections, which informs my first hypothesis. Victor Ojekarato's From Authoritarian Rule to Political Democracy argues that the traditional use of violence in Nigerian elections by politicians compromise the democratic prospects of the country, which informs my second hypothesis. Ballin and Jackman's argument in Political Democracy and the Size of Distribution of Income argues that democracy promotes an egalitarian distribution of income, and this informs my third hypothesis. My independent variables and hypotheses. For my first independent variable, I used the question, how much do you trust the president, to indicate the concept of trust in the government. I hypothesized a strong positive correlation between a lack of trust in the government and a low prospect for democracy. For my second independent variable, fear of violence, I used the indicator question, is safety from violent crime worse or better than a few years ago? I hypothesized a strong positive correlation between worse safety conditions and low democratic prospects. My third independent variable, income inequality, is indicated by the question, has the gap between the rich and the poor gotten better or worse than they were a few years ago, or have they remained the same? I hypothesized a strong correlation between worse income inequalities and low democratic prospects. My correlation results were as follows. All of my independent variables strongly correlated with the dependent variable, with hypothesis 1 yielding a Pearson's R result of 0.2627, which is fairly strong and accounts for variation in the dependent variable 6.9% of the time. Hypothesis 2 yielded a strong result of 0.3643, which is very strong and accounts for 13% of variance in the dependent variable. Hypothesis 3 yielded the weakest result, but was moderately strong with a result of 0.2427, accounts for 5.8% of variance in the dependent variable. Combined, the hypotheses account for 25.7% of variance seen in the dependent variable. I followed up my correlation results, my regression results. Points of interest of the R-square values of 0.18518 and 0.18405, meaning that the variance seen in the dependent variable can be explained by the independent variables 18% of the time. The B-values show the democratic prospect relies more on trust in the government than income inequality and the fear and threat of violence. And the beta values show that trust in the government has more of an influence on the dependent variable. The significance of 0.000 shows that the results are not due to a sampling error. My fourth hypothesis was that gender would influence income inequality, and thus influence democratic prospects. My rationale comes from Ruth Oyler's work, Disparities of Economic Reform in Nigeria, in which she argues that if one is a woman, they are likely to experience income inequality and may have a low opinion of democratic prospects. I appealed to the use of dummy variables to replicate this idea. The regression using dummy variables controls for the effect of gender, with every other category behaving as a dummy. The adjusted R-square shows that about 8.6% invariance in dependent variable is explained by income inequality, region, and education. Here, income inequality is challenged by post-secondary education in its influence over the democratic process. Note that the tolerance level of 0.5 and greater, which indicates no problem of multicollinearity, and the significance level of 0.000, which indicates the results are due to a sampling error. Introducing a female variable marginally decreases the explained variance to 8.5. Beta values and B values also show that gender has a smaller influence on the dependent variable than most of my dummies. Conclusion. While justice in government, income inequality, and the fear of violence do affect the perceived democratic prospects in Nigerian citizens, it is questionable whether males or females differ in that perception. This research can be transferred to many other democracies to uncover what enables them to thrive in the eyes of the citizens, what enables democracy to thrive in the eyes of the citizens, and what doesn't. Future research on the matter, in terms of Nigeria, can delve more into the question of ethnicity. The research has also suggested that ethnic relations often determine the democratic prospects in a nation. And here is my syntax. Thank you for listening to my presentation.